Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you're a podcast warrior and you've gotten to number 6 of 6 in this series, then good on you. If you're just joining me or just new to the podcast, you certainly don't have to listen to the previous 5 in this series. But yeah, this will hopefully be helpful regardless. But in case you haven't listened to the first 5, I'll kind of go through those quickly. So the first thing we talked about was an affection and duty list, which that probably needs a lot more explanation, but that's developing a list of people in your life, typically over the age of 65, that you're either currently providing some sort of support or care for, or may in the future. And how we put people on that list kind of depends on our affection or our duty. And the second part of the series was the what kind of support or care might this person need? And we broke that down into time, which is time expended in like caregiving or appointments or case management or other support. Touch, which is like the direct caregiving, helping somebody with dressing, bathing, going to the bathroom, taking a shower. Or treasure, which is more like the financial aspect of it or supporting somebody with housing or other care-related costs. So a lot of us have different makeups of who's on that list with the who and what kind of care that we can or can't support with. And then the next one we talked about was where. Where is the support system located? Where is the person located? And as their needs change, how do they move through the system? For the fourth podcast, we talked about when, which is just talking about the timing of support or the timing of certain needs and how that timing might match well or not match well with your time in life, and just a general discussion about different disease processes and how they might present. Then the fifth of the sixth in the series was why. That was an in-depth discussion of reflecting on why or why not supporting somebody or providing extra resources when they need it. Now, the pragmatic side. So we kind of stepped through the 5 W's already, and I saved this for last because I don't want to provide a podcast that just has a lot of thinking, although I do like thinking, and I think about these topics all the time and write full podcasts in my head and then never record them. But for the how, this is really meant to be sort of a summative, but what do we do with this information? What do we do next? Or even how do we move through this information? Now, it's beyond the scope of this podcast for me to mention every which way we might be able to answer the how question, but I do want to keep it pretty focused on some pragmatic approaches that I know have been mentioned before, but kind of bring them together in the what to do next. And not necessarily you have to go through this process immediately, but if something were to come up, I'd like the idea that you have a process to follow, or just be reassured that there are some steps you can take. Of all the things we can't control, there are a couple of things we can, so we're going to focus on that today. So in my pathway through the how, again, this is not meant to be completely comprehensive. And I think the podcast as a whole, my hope is that it serves as piecemealing over time, lots of different components or options for the how, because of course, every situation is individual. It would be impossible and probably inappropriate for me to say it should happen exactly this way. But I'm talking to you. You are the person that this podcast is aimed towards. I am here to support you. I am thinking about you. And so we're going to talk about things that you can do at this point. The first thing is I want to propose that we create a space to tolerate the uncertainty, the fear, the gravity of this topic, and just kind of sit with it. Maybe even lean into it. But if you can't lean into it, just sit with it. The reason why is that this is the first big stop sign in the head. The brain is saying, nope, there's too much unknown. This is a triggering topic. I don't want to think about myself aging or someone else aging or loss or disability or the pressure I may feel to help someone or the guilt I may feel if I don't, or what that may mean for my marriage or my career or for that person. It's much easier just to focus on the day-to-day. One of the reasons I'm sure you're listening to this is either you're in the thick of it or facing that potentially in your future. I want to let the brain just sort of have this little fit, because that's usually what it's going to do at the beginning. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. It brings up a whole lot of issues, especially related to things like the finality or the finite nature of life, end of life type issues or care. We kind of like to go about our lives and not worry or think about this. But I would submit to you, hopefully one of the reasons that you're listening to a podcast like this is of all the things that we can't have influence over or control, one of the things we can do is at least create a room in our head, a space in our head that's starting to get their arms around this topic. And I would submit to you that, like most things in life, the avoidance and hoping it doesn't happen is not usually the best proactive way to prepare, although obviously that is maybe the default for some people. So anyway, I would say the first thing I'm going to do is just anticipate it. Of if we're going to sit down and actually tackle this and put people on a list and start thinking through different scenarios, is just know ahead of time. Almost like if I told you, hey, you're going to be on a road trip and you don't have any snacks and you can't stop for gas. So you're not going to eat for 12 hours. You already know you're going to get hungry, which I don't know. Why did I just say that? That doesn't even make sense. But the idea is, let's just know how your body's going to react. You just understand that that is what the brain's going to do. But the step one here, the reason I say this is tolerating that uncertainty and tolerating the anxiety or fear that sets in and just kind of sitting through it, not necessarily joining it, but understanding it, acknowledging it. And the way I like to think about it is almost like a beach ball that pops up to the surface. Instead of trying to smash it back down and spend a lot of time hoping that these things don't happen and trying to control all these things that you can't really control, is just let the beach ball pop up on the surface, stand there with it, and then let it float away. The secret is it's really difficult for the brain to sustain that fit, that sort of uncertainty, fear, and anxiety fit for too long. It might be able to pop it up, every once in a while, but once you sit there with it and it floats away, you're building a new pathway beyond that fear and uncertainty. And of course, you can use this strategy for so many things in life, but the idea is on the other side of this, like your brain is basically having an electrical storm. Your brain is actually telling you, if you don't stop thinking about this, on the other side of this topic is more pain, fear, and anxiety, or you might die. Like, they can get really bad. I mean, that's where you're getting the surge and anxiety. Like, it's kind of a fight or flight. It can turn your stomach. It can make you feel lightheaded. Your chest can feel like it's pressured. And all of these are sort of somatic or physical manifestations of that stop sign. But you and I both know you have to go to a different part of the brain that isn't quite as rooted in fight or flight or emotionality and say, but this is really important to me. This is important to me. It's important to people I care about. It's important to my planning. It's important to my future. And so you kind of wait it out as that toddler part of the brain kind of says, no, I don't want to think about this. I want to talk about this. And you just take a deep breath and work through it. But once you can tolerate that, I know that on the other side of this is some productive conversation, if nowhere else in your head. One of the ways you can help the brain is kind of what we talked about in episode 1, is to use really neutral language. It may be easier, instead of using a person on the list, that you de-identify it and just say a person, or maybe somebody else's mom or dad, and change the names in the math equation. The more neutral the language can get, and you might have to iterate a couple of times and figure out what works, that can really help the brain finally engage. Because the whole reason I'm talking about this is the brain can't engage very well in planning or problem solving when it's anxious or in fear. That's just, not for sure, not long-term planning, maybe how to get out of the house in a fire, but like it is actually thinking that that world's on fire and it's a very scary topic. And so it's looking for an exit and not looking for long-term planning. So it's a different, literally functionally a different part of the brain, the part of the brain right behind your forehead that does the long-term planning and decision making, and then the part of the brain at the back of your head kind of towards your neck. That's a part of the brain that makes sort of these fight or flight, world's on fire type decisions. And so if you are someone who this topic taps into the bottom part of the brain, the more primitive part of the brain, then you might have a little bit more work to do, because we want to move up into the top newest part of the brain, which is directly behind the forehead. So once we've kind of worked through that, and maybe you don't have that surge, but I know for me, part of doing the podcast was to help rewire my brain and get past some of that. The next thing we're going to do is I want to find a way to have a conversation. And that sounds scary because you think, oh my goodness, like, I don't know if I could talk to my mother about this or my father about this. The first conversation I want you to have is with yourself. If you can't talk to yourself and get to some level of familiarity with how your body and your brain is reacting, I would suggest you're perhaps not ready to talk to people on the outside. So it's kind of like fix your house first, right? And try to get that. I'm not saying perfect. I'm just saying to a point where you're engaging, and I'm sure you can feel it, engaging in it in a healthy and productive way as much as possible. So that conversation is all the things we just talked about, the 5 W's, maybe in a more summarized fashion or maybe in a different order. But the idea that the brain is approaching it like a problem-solving issue and not the fight or flight. And it does take some time, and it might take talking to yourself for weeks. It might take listening to a lot of podcasts. I love doing interviews is I want to provide to other people an example of how other brains go through this. And they can either identify with that, they can learn something from it, or they can say, oh, wait, I'm glad my brain's not doing that. The next conversation I would encourage you to have is if you have a close spouse or partner or something like that, that's sort of in the boat with you, right? So it's unlikely that you decide to support your mom and then your spouse decides to support their mom, and those are completely separate decisions. Usually that's kind of a family decision. So in bringing my grandmother to come live with us, the first person I talked to was my husband, and then my grandmother was the third person I talked to. So that will also usually be, hopefully, a healthier, more forgiving space to have difficult conversations, have the emotions come up and tolerate them, and start asking and talking about this. Again, you might have some stop signs in your brain that are trying to get you out of a burning building, but I promise you, just having the conversation will not light the room on fire, even if it feels like it. But that's that next person. And maybe it's not a spouse, maybe it's a sibling. Maybe the more appropriate next conversation is if you have 1 sibling or 5 siblings, it's some sort of discussion, even if informal, on have we thought about this? What are your thoughts about this? And whatever the conversation is, I would highly recommend kind of open-ended curiosity-based questions, not like, why didn't you do this? Or I'm sure you're planning to do this, right? Or I'm counting on you to do this. Like literally approaching it as a know-nothing mind, which is like, I don't really know. Because in a lot of ways you don't, right? You don't know exactly what's going to happen. You don't know what kind of resources are going to be there to meet the need when it occurs, but starting to figure that out. And the person that you're helping, I mean, you can think about the person you're helping as the aging parent themselves or whoever the elder is in question, of course, right? Let's just put that as a given. But the real person that you're helping is your future self. And because I get to work with those versions of the future selves who are completely lost and completely overwhelmed at a time when they probably wish they felt more prepared or more in control, this work is serving that future version of yourself. I can't tell you how many times I've stood in a room with somebody who's incapacitated, meaning they cannot communicate for whatever reason, usually a stroke or a brain injury. And all we have are those previous conversations. I mean, there might be like a will or a power of attorney paperwork or, advance directives. Of course, that's on there too. But in a lot of cases, we don't have advance directives. And so we sit around talking to the person who last talked to this person and try to construct the last thing that they would have said about their wishes or desires of how to be cared for. And so when I say a conversation, I don't take that lightly. Like that one conversation, even if it's a side discussion over Christmas, that might end up being the conversation we have to base everything on in the clinical world. That would be the most recent one with somebody who's close to the patient in the absence of any other information. And it can get even more challenging when somebody wrote advance directives, say 5 years ago or something. And then we have a family member who had a more recent conversation that's in conflict with the advance directive. That's a whole other thing. But really, because of the sudden issues, we talked about the timing before, and the when podcast, especially if it's sudden like a stroke or brain injury, then we don't really have the luxury of asking that patient and gathering information. And so these conversations are kind of, I would say, conversations with a big C, like they matter. And so getting that conversation with yourself, finding a good place, not the perfect place, as good as can be, finding support in your spouse or your siblings would be the next one. And then last but not least, that conversation with the older adult, the aging parent in your life is really important. Now, I did put together a whole PDF about this. It's on my website if you'd like to download it. It has all these different prompts, but they basically all fall along the lines of open questions, curiosity, and coming from a place of, I want to do the best by you. I want to be the best support I can for you. Have you thought about XYZ? Do you have thoughts on XYZ? And you'd be surprised. I've been surprised in both directions. Some people are really a lot more open than you ever would have anticipated, like specifically on that topic. And then I've had other people that have had this conversation or have been part of these conversations where someone just shuts down. It's just too much for them to process their own disability or mortality, something like that. If you go back to episode 9, that's actually the conversation with my dad. So that's an example. I literally recorded the conversation I'm talking about. I recorded it when I had it with my dad. And so you can feel free to go back and listen to that. It's not a perfect conversation. It's kind of meandering, and we go into some difficult topics, and I get the best answers I can get. I recorded them, so it'd be easier for me to go back and reference them. But anyway, so that's the conversation. This is back to the how, and that's that conversation. Remember, first with yourself, usually second with like a spouse or sibling or other interested party, and then third with the individual that has come up as somebody who might need some support. So remember, number 1 was tolerating the uncertainty. Number 2 was finding a way to have that conversation. Number 3 is cost prevention. This is going to be sort of a hodgepodge of a lot of things that we've talked about before. So I'm not going to belabor each one of these in extreme detail, but going into cost prevention as the how, maybe even resource preservation, you want to save as much money and resources as possible. The first one I have is home modifications, specifically the ingress and egress, how they get into and out of the home, making that easier with things like handrails or ramps. A lot of falls happen in the garage or getting out of the vehicle or trying to get into the home, especially because people tend to be carrying things, even as small as a purse, and that might take up one of their upper extremities to manage that. Or maybe they're using a cane to try to go upstairs and then opening the door. If you've ever tried to open the door on a landing that's kind of shallow, and then you have to step back as the door opens towards you, and then you can notice it's pretty easy to fall down the stairs backwards. But anyway, opening the door towards yourself and then stepping back close to the stairs can be challenging. But the ingress and egress, how you get in and out of the house, is important, not just for fall prevention, but just overall safety if somebody needed to get out of the house in an emergency. We talked a bit about bathroom remodels. My big thing is trying to get a level entry into the shower, preferably 36 inches wide. If you can't manage that, maybe 30 inches. Trying to get the door to the bathroom widened, especially if it's closer to 24 or 26 inches. And then raising the toilet seat and adding grab bars. There's a lot more to it than that, but I'm just kind of doing some high-level review. And then we talked a lot about flooring as well back in the Where podcast. Number 2, so number 1 would be home modifications, and no specific order. I don't have any statistical reason to put these in this order. But anyway, number 2 would be adherence to medical care. So again, this kind of goes into how do we prevent things from happening in the future to the extent possible that's reasonable and not too invasive for the person that you're helping to support, is helping them be adherent to medical care, which would be medication compliance, making their appointments, following up on things. They might go to a primary care appointment and leave there with 3 new appointments. So you need to go see so-and-so for a colonoscopy, go see so-and-so to check out that spot on your forehead, go see a dermatologist to biopsy that. I mean, they may come out of there with 3 or 4 to-dos, right? And a lot of offices are not necessarily connected to the community. Like you have to actually go and chase this down and find the appointment and then make sure they take your insurance and go through with that. So for somebody who's in their, say, 70s or 80s, that can be challenging to follow through on all those things. So helping them be adherent to medical care can be a good cost avoidance strategy. Number 3 is protecting mobility and abiling falls to the extent possible, prolonging and protecting independent ambulation. So somebody's ability to get out of bed and get to the bathroom, somebody's ability to get out of bed and get to a microwave to warm up some food for lunch. That is a Rubicon, like the ability to get in and out of bed to go to the bathroom and just the ability to say, I want to stand up and go somewhere. That is a huge quality of life and independence measure. So to the extent possible, you can protect mobility, whether that's helping assist somebody in an exercise program. Maybe they need 1 or 2 visits with a physical therapist, even if it's out of pocket up front. In most areas, it's fairly easy to get a physical therapy eval if you're concerned about somebody's gait or fall prevention, even a couple of sessions with a physical therapist to get somebody on a home exercise program, things they can do at home. But I would put that pennies on the dollar to help avoid future falls and all the things that come with that, if you can help protect mobility. And that up to and including the use of assistive devices. And that circles back to podcast 88, where we talked a lot about canes and wheelchairs and so forth. So, all right. So number 1 was home modifications. Number 2 was adherence to medical care. Number 3 was protecting mobility to the extent possible. Number 4, and there's 6 here, so we don't have too much further to go. Number 4 is protecting your own relationships. And that's with yourself, with your spouse, with your siblings, with the parent. It can get really easy, especially in a stressful situation, to kind of lose sight of that. But those are the same people that are going to be with you on the other side of it, especially if that aging parent ends up passing away or whatever happens. I mean, that is your support system too. There's nothing wrong with being aware of and keeping tabs on your relationship with yourself and these other people, not just the aging parent. And you still have your own siblings maybe, or children or coworkers, close friends, and those relationships need to be watered as well, because, we're all kind of rotating in different contiguous ecosystems, right? And so that's your care system. That's the people that are going to be taking care of you and supporting you. And, it doesn't really help if those relationships start to suffer or deteriorate because, kind of operating in a vacuum, that this is the most important task right now. Well, you might come back after the task is resolved or completed in some way and then have some difficulty elsewhere. And so always keeping that and knowing it's okay to keep your eye on the health of those relationships. And the other thing I would say on this point is there is no boundary fairy that's coming to just suddenly give you boundaries. Boundaries are one of the strongest features of a healthy relationship and can help contribute to longevity and can help contribute to avoiding things like burnout and resentment. And so opposite of what you think a strong boundary is going to make things difficult or add friction, but a strong boundary might be exactly what you need. The problem is there is just no boundary fairy that's going to show up and say, hey, you know what? Your kid has a soccer game on Friday night. You can't go and do this for this person. You can't. So it has to be something that originates from your intrinsic value system, from your kind of reasoning and making tough decisions and either asking for help or drawing boundaries where possible. And I understand in crises, it's more challenging, but in the quiet times, right? You might have a financial boundary and say, look, I can't contribute financially. And that's up to you, right? Other people might judge you, they might pressure you, whatever, but that's your personal business, right? And one of the ideas is, how do you know you need a boundary? What are some ways that we know that a boundary might be indicated? And I would encourage you to go back to episode number 57 about resentment. There's a lot of talk about boundaries in that episode. But anyway, so number 1, right? Just a feeling. I'm feeling overwhelmed or resentful. These feelings think of them like little text messages or like little flashing indicators like, hey, we might be needing a boundary here, okay? Loss of your personal time to take care of your own personal needs. You might need to find ways to set up boundaries to protect that. If nothing else, it's an indication you may need a boundary. Whether or not you decide a boundary works in that area, that's a totally different discussion. If you're having trouble with other relationships, you're noticing problems in your marriage, you're missing things that are important to you for other people in your life, then you might need a boundary. You're having a lot of health problems. Maybe you're getting poor sleep, you're getting sick frequently, exhaustion, headaches, emotional symptoms. Then, hey, these are other indications that you might need to look at setting some new boundaries. It can be very difficult, especially if you've gone a long time without these respective boundaries, to instill them and adhere to them, but it can be one of the best things to help improve the long-term sustainability of that situation. So some of the worst situations, maybe one of the more rare but sensitive issues, is your own personal safety. And there are some occasions with people that the actual physical provision of care, so lifting somebody out of bed and getting them to and from the bathroom, may endanger your own health and safety. And that could cause things like back injuries, shoulder injuries, etc. Or in the very, very sad and rare cases of dementias that would come with like agitation and aggression. If you're getting to a point where your physical health and safety is at risk, obviously, please consider adding some significant boundaries in that area to help protect your own health and safety. If nobody else told you could, then please mark this and say that I told you could for sure. So we've got a couple more left on like cost prevention under the how part of this episode. Number five is, I think, spending any amount of time with a good estate attorney or an elder law attorney is worth it. And it might sound like a ton of money. Usually they charge somewhere between $400 and $500 for 1 hour. But if you go in armed with like 75 questions, you can even use AI to kind of type in your situation and it will generate questions you could take in and really help understand the situation with your respective loved one, especially if there's something already happening or you have some concerns. Then spending time with an attorney or even some time doing some deeper research on things like the Medicaid rules in your specific area. What would happen, like moving mom across state lines, you may end up causing more issues. Like if she's living in a state currently where her retirement account is protected for Medicaid, and you move her into a state where it's no longer protected, that can be an issue. There's even some states where the spouse's retirement account is considered basically it needs to be spent down before they can qualify for Medicaid. So you might drain two people's retirement accounts on the way to Medicaid if you're in the wrong state for that. And if you're not sure, spending some time with a professional, even without the aging parent, just to sit down and ask really, really deep, nuanced question for your situation could be really helpful. Again, I know that sounds like a lot of money up front, but it could be pennies on the dollar of saving you some time and some worry. And how does this actually work in my specific region or area? And last but not least, under the cost prevention, I have task preservation. And I use that word to mean of all the things we want to do to help somebody, the last thing you should do is overhelp and take on tasks that are actually functioning and working. So, for example, if somebody is doing well at mowing their lawn and they're doing it safely, and you say, well, I'd like to come over and mow your lawn on Saturday mornings, that feels like a way I can contribute. And maybe that works. Maybe that is the best thing for that situation. But I would caution you that you might be removing a physical activity for them that they actually enjoy and do regularly. Or there might be a social interaction when that person is out mowing their lawn and they're talking to a neighbor. Might be taking the social interaction away. And they might not want to tell you like, hey, I actually like mowing the lawn because it keeps me active and I get to talk to so-and-so. Or they might feel like, hey, I have to accept help. I'm the person that needs to be open to accepting help, something like that. So I'd be careful not to sort of overly analyze an aging adult or all aging adults. But anyway, you know what I mean. And take tasks away from them or substitute in help for tasks that they are completing safely. I didn't say perfectly, but safely, and focus on the things that really are failing or causing difficulty, or even just task preservation. Like, how can I make it easier for them to continue to pay their own bills, or make it easier for them to continue to cook at home or safer, as opposed to, okay, now I need to figure out how to do a meal service. So task preservation in and of itself doesn't come naturally to us, especially when you're trying to help somebody. But think of it, once we lose that task, it can be very difficult to reclaim the task. So just be cognizant, even of people that I think are very well-meaning. And trust me, we see this all the time in rehab. We have to actually sometimes remove the family member from the rehab setting because they're doing too much, right? They're babying that patient too much and not allowing them to do things on their own. So last but not least, okay, so we started with tolerating the uncertainty. Then we went into finding a way to have that conversation. Then we went into cost avoidance or prevention strategies. And then last but not least, and then we'll wrap up right after this, is go on with your life, right? Don't have this podcast to monopolize your life or your mind and make you worry about this. The whole reason is to kind of worry about it, think about it, and then put it away. Go on with your life and focus on connection with yourself, with others, especially with the person that you think you might end up supporting. And I would suggest, to the extent possible, not letting all of this interfere with that connection. The connection is all you're ever going to have with anybody else. That could be a good connection or a bad connection, but it's still connection. And that's what's going to sustain you through really difficult times and what's going to stay with you after that person has exited the earth. Is that's all we really have left, is that connection to them and those memories and all those times that we got to spend together. So, I know it sounds weird because I harp so much on all these little things, but the purpose here at the end of the day is to go on with your life. Know that you have some resources, that you have some planning, that you have some support here, if nothing else, and then focus on connection with yourself and with others. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for getting through this series. If you enjoyed the series, please share it and leave me a review. Please send me an email, story@RebeccaTapiaMD.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I will talk to you soon. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or two, sometimes 3, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.